2 weeks before Christmas, in 1967, a bridge full of holiday traffic dropped into the Ohio River in a single second. It was almost 5 in the evening. The light was already gone from the sky. Cars and trucks sat nearly bumper to bumper across the span. Headlights on, heaters running, the radio playing something about the season. Some of the drivers were coming home from the plants and the shops. Some had spent the afternoon hunting for presents in Gallipolis, Ohio, and were headed back to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with bags in the back seat. A few of them waved at people they knew in the next lane. Then there was a sound. The survivors would describe it the same way, over and over, for the rest of their lives. Like a shotgun, like a rifle, going off right next to your ear. And in less than the time it takes to read this sentence, the entire suspended length of the Silver Bridge folded like a deck of cards and went into the water, taking more than 30 vehicles and the people inside them down into the dark, freezing river. 46 of them would not come home. The question that haunted everyone afterward, the question that engineers spent the next 3 years chasing, was simple and terrible. What could possibly knock down a 40-year-old steel bridge in 1 second, with no warning, on an ordinary Friday? The answer was hiding in a single piece of metal smaller than your forearm, behind a crack you could have covered with a fingernail. And the way they finally found it changed the rules for every bridge you have ever driven across. Let me take you back to where it started. The Silver Bridge opened on the 30th of May, 1928. Its official name was the Point Pleasant Bridge, but almost nobody called it that. The steel had been coated in a bright aluminum paint, and in the sun, it shone a clean silver color over the water. So that is what the people of Point Pleasant named it, the Silver Bridge. It was a genuine source of pride. For the first time, you could drive straight across the Ohio River between West Virginia and Ohio at this point, carrying United States Route 35. Before the bridge, you took a ferry, and the ferry did not run when the river was high or the ice was bad. The bridge changed daily life for thousands of families. It connected the mills and the stores and the schools on both banks. It was, for a small river town, a piece of the modern world arriving on its doorstep. The bridge was built by the American Bridge Company and designed by the J.E. Greiner Company, both serious and respected firms. It stretched a little over 2,200 feet from end to end, with a main span of about 700 feet reaching across the deepest part of the channel, and it was built using a design that was, at the time, considered clever and economical. That word, economical, is going to matter a great deal before we are done. Most suspension bridges you picture have great woven cables, thousands of thin steel wires bundled together into a rope as thick as a tree trunk, draped over the towers. The Silver Bridge did not use cables. It used something called an eyebar chain. Picture a bicycle chain, but enormous. Each link in the Silver Bridge chain was a flat steel bar, about 2 inches thick and somewhere between 45 and 55 feet long, with a hole, an eye, at each end. You connected one link to the next by sliding a heavy steel pin through the overlapping eyes, the way you would join 2 links of a chain with a bolt. Stack those bars end to end, link after link, draped over the towers, and you had your suspension chain. The roadway hung from it. Now here is the part that doomed them, though nobody knew it for 40 years. On older eyebar bridges, builders used 4 or more bars side by side in every single link. If one bar developed a flaw, the others could carry the load. There was margin, there was a backup. Engineers have a word for that idea. They call it redundancy. It is the whole reason an airplane has more than one engine. The Silver Bridge had only 2 eyebars per link. The designers were not being reckless, at least not by the thinking of their day. They were using a brand new, higher strength steel, far stronger than what older bridges had used, strong enough that 2 bars could do the work that used to take 4. It saved steel. It saved weight. It saved money. On paper, the math worked. The safety factor checked out. Everything was within the standards of 1923, which is when those standards had last been written. But 2 is a fragile number. With 4 bars, you can lose one and survive. With 2 bars in a link, the failure of a single bar puts the entire weight of that chain onto its one remaining partner. And a chain, by its nature, is only as strong as its weakest link. There is no spreading the load to a neighbor. There is no second path for the force to travel. If one link lets go, the chain lets go, and everything hanging from it comes down. For 39 years, none of that mattered. The bridge stood. People crossed it tens of thousands of times. But the world that drove across the Silver Bridge in 1928 was not the world that drove across it in 1967. In 1928, the heaviest thing on that bridge was a Model T Ford weighing perhaps 1,500 pounds. By the late 1960s, the bridge carried full-sized American sedans, loaded delivery trucks, and tractor-trailers hauling tonnage that the original designers had never imagined. The traffic was heavier, more frequent, and far weightier than anything the bridge was drawn up to hold. Every car that crossed pulled on those chains a little. Every truck pulled harder. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, the steel was being stressed and flexed, and worked in ways its makers never planned for. It is worth pausing on how completely a town like Point Pleasant lived through that bridge. This was an Ohio River Valley town, a place of factories and farms, and the kind of close, settled life where families stayed put for generations. The Silver Bridge was not a piece of scenery to them. It was the road to work, the road to the doctor, the road to the bigger stores across the water, the road the school buses and the ambulances and the delivery trucks all used. People crossed it without thinking, the way you cross your own kitchen. A man might drive over it 4 times a day and never once glance up at the chains that held him in the air. That is what a bridge becomes when it has stood your whole life. It stops being a structure and becomes a fact, as fixed and dependable as the riverbank itself, which is exactly why what was coming would feel less like an accident and more like the ground itself betraying them. And somewhere up near the top of the Ohio Tower, inside the eye of a single bar, something had begun very quietly to go wrong. That bar had a number. After the disaster, investigators would come to know it intimately. They called it eyebar 330. It sat in the north chain on the Ohio side, in the very first link below the top of the tower, in a joint they labeled C13N. To everyone driving over it, it was invisible, just one piece of painted steel among hundreds, holding up a road. But eyebar 330 was carrying a secret crack, and that crack had been growing in the dark for years. Now come back to the 15th of December, 1967. It was a Friday, 10 days before Christmas. The kind of evening when a river town empties its workplaces all at once and everybody tries to get home, and half of them stop to shop on the way. The shift was letting out. The stores in Gallipolis were busy. And the Silver Bridge, the only quick way across the river, was filling up with the heaviest kind of traffic there is, slow traffic, stop and go, cars rolling forward a few feet and braking, trucks idling, a long line of steel and rubber and people, packed nose to tail, all of it sitting still on a bridge designed in 1926. Think about what that means for the bridge. Moving traffic spreads its weight out. Stopped traffic concentrates it. Instead of a few vehicles passing over at speed, you now had dozens of them parked across the span at once. A dense column of cold December metal, every pound of it pulling down on those 2 slender chains. A young man named Howard Boggs was on the bridge that evening. He was 24 years old, from Bidwell, Ohio. With him in the car were his wife Marjorie, who was 18, and their daughter, who was just 17 months old. They had only just started across. Boggs felt the bridge doing what it always seemed to do in traffic, bouncing gently up and down under the weight, a motion the locals had grown used to and stopped noticing. A pregnant woman named Charlene Wood was driving home from work. and she went up onto the bridge too. But she felt something different. She felt a vibration underneath her that did not feel right, a shudder that the bridge had no business making. Something about it frightened her enough that she did the one thing almost no one else thought to do. She threw her car into reverse and backed off the span, back towards solid ground. She made it to the edge with seconds to spare, because at that moment, up at joint C13N on the Ohio Tower, eyebar 330 reached the end of its long secret. The crack inside its eye, after years of silent growth, finally crossed the line from a flaw into a fracture. The lower limb of the bar broke clean through, snapping in a brittle, sudden way, the way a cold piece of glass breaks rather than bending. And there was no backup. There was no third bar. There was no neighbor to catch the load. In the instant that eyebar 330 let go, the entire weight it had been carrying slammed onto its single remaining partner, which could not hold it, and tore apart in turn. With both bars gone, the chain on that side simply opened. A pin slipped free. The link came apart completely. The chain that had held up one side of the silver bridge for 39 years was, all at once, no longer a chain. What happens next happens in less time than you can think about it. With one chain gone, the towers were yanked sideways. The roadway lost the thing that was holding it in the air, and the whole suspended section, around 1,400 feet of bridge with all its traffic, dropped toward the river. Witnesses on the banks heard that crack like a gunshot and then watched the unthinkable. The bridge keeled over. It started to go on the Ohio side and folded toward West Virginia, link after link, span after span, collapsing in a wave. People who saw it said it was over in seconds. Some said less than 20. Down it all went into the cold water and the December dark. Inside the cars, there was no time to do anything at all. Howard Boggs went into the river with the bridge. He never fully understood how he survived. The way he told it later, the old bridge was bouncing the way it always did, and then suddenly, everything was falling down around him, and his feet touched the bottom of the river. He must have blacked out. The next thing he knew, he had come back to the surface, and he was clinging to a floating barrel in the freezing current. His wife and his baby daughter were gone. Their bodies would be found later, still inside the family car, at the bottom of the Ohio River. Charlene Wood, who had trusted that strange vibration and backed away, was alive on the bank, watching the place where she would have been. 4 months later, in April of 1968, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, who came into the world only because their mother had felt something wrong and listened to it. In the water, it was chaos. The river that evening was bitterly cold. Around 64 people had fallen with the bridge. People on shore and in boats pulled at the ones they could reach, but the current was strong and the cold worked fast, and most of the cars had gone straight down. Of everyone who fell, only a handful were pulled alive from the water itself. Rescuers, neighbors, anyone with a boat, worked into the night, and for days after, dragging the river, opening the recovered cars, searching the banks downstream, they found the dead one by one. 44 of the 46 victims were eventually recovered and identified. 2 of them, 2 people from Point Pleasant, were never found at all. The river simply kept them. A town of a few thousand people lost 46 of its own in under a minute, 10 days before Christmas. Almost everyone in Point Pleasant knew someone in the water. The presents that had been bought that afternoon were never wrapped. There are families in that valley who still gather every 15th of December, decades on, to read the names out loud. And the survivors carried it for the rest of their lives. Howard Boggs lived, but he lived having lost his young wife and his baby girl in the space of a heartbeat. On a Friday evening, when all they had been doing was driving home, Charlene Wood lived and gave the world 2 children, and surely spent every December afterward turning over in her mind that single decision to put the car in reverse. The people who came home that night came home to phone calls and knocks at the door, to neighbors and cousins and co-workers who were simply gone. A river town does not forget a wound like that. It folds it into who the town is. Generations later, the children and grandchildren of the people who died at that bridge still live along that same stretch of the Ohio, and they still know exactly what the 15th of December means. But grief, by itself, does not knock down a bridge. The country needed to know what had, and so, while Point Pleasant was still burying its dead, a different kind of work began. The wreckage was hauled up out of the Ohio River, piece by twisted piece, and laid out so that investigators could study it. This was a major federal effort. The collapse became one of the first big cases for what would soon be the National Transportation Safety Board, the same kind of investigation you associate with plane crashes. Engineers and metallurgists went over the recovered steel like detectives over a crime scene, because that is exactly what they were doing. They were looking for the first thing that broke. In a chain reaction, everything ends up broken. The trick is to find which break came first, the one that started it all, while every other piece was failing only because it was the second domino, or the 10th. The clue was in the way the towers had fallen. The rocker towers had toppled toward the east, and that direction told the engineers which chain had given way first. It pointed them to the Ohio side, to the north chain, to that first link below the tower, and there, in the recovered steel, they found eyebar 330. This kind of reconstruction is painstaking, unglamorous work, and it is the reason we know anything at all. The river had scattered the bridge across the channel, and downstream, a vast field of bent and shattered steel that had to be lifted, sorted, and laid back out, piece against piece, almost like rebuilding the skeleton of an animal from bones spread across a hillside. Every fracture surface tells a story to a trained eye. A piece that failed first looks different from a piece that was simply torn apart afterward. The investigators studied the broken faces of the metal under magnification, reading the texture of each break the way you might read tree rings, distinguishing the slow, patient surface where a crack had been creeping for years from the sudden, rough surface where the steel had finally let go all at once. They tested the chemistry of the steel. They measured the stresses the design had placed on each part. Slowly, out of all that wreckage, a single piece separated itself from the rest as the one that had broken before anything else broke around it. When they examined it, they found the answer to everything. The bar had broken at a crack in the eye, the loop of steel around the pin, and the crack, the thing that had killed 46 people and dropped an entire bridge into a river, was astonishingly small. It was only about 1/10 of an inch deep, 2.5 millimeters, smaller than the thickness of a few coins stacked together. You could have hidden it under the edge of your thumbnail. How could something that small bring down something that large? The explanation is a quiet horror story written in metal, and it has a name: stress corrosion cracking. Here is what had happened over those 40 years. The eye of the bar was clamped tight around its pin, under enormous and constant tension from the weight of the bridge. That joint was exposed to the weather, to rain, to road grime, to the slightly acidic, polluted air of an industrial river valley in the middle of the 20th century. Where the bar pressed against the pin, the two pieces of metal rubbed and fretted against each other under load, a tiny grinding that wore at the surface. Moisture got in. Corrosion began, deep in a place no eye would ever see, right at the most highly stressed point of the most critical part of the bridge. And then three things combined and fed on each other. There was the relentless pulling tension of the load, there was the chemical attack of corrosion eating at the steel, and there was fatigue, the slow weakening that comes from millions of cycles of stress as traffic crossed and the bridge flexed. The same way a paperclip bent back and forth will eventually snap. Tension opened the steel, corrosion crept into the opening, fatigue widened it. Each one helped the others. A microscopic pit became a tiny crack. The tiny crack grew, atom by atom, year by year, deep inside the eye of the bar. completely sealed off from the outside world. The steel itself made it worse. That high-strength steel the designers had loved, the strong stuff that let them use only 2 bars, had a hidden weakness. Steels like that can be brittle. They can be strong and stiff right up until the moment they fail, and then fail suddenly, snapping rather than stretching, giving no warning at all. A more forgiving metal might have bent, sagged, groaned, dropped a bolt, done something to announce that it was in trouble, and by a few minutes. This steel did none of that. It held, and held, and held, and then in one cold December instant, it simply broke. The crack grew until the remaining sound metal could no longer carry the load, and once it crossed that threshold, the rest happened faster than any human being could react. Now here is the detail that turned this from a tragedy into a national scandal and a turning point. That crack was on the inside of the eye, around the pin, buried inside an assembled joint. With the inspection methods available in 1967, with men climbing the bridge and looking at it and tapping it, there was no way to see it. It was, in the plain words of the investigation, inaccessible to visual inspection. You could not have found that crack by looking, no matter how carefully you looked, no matter how often. To find it, you would have had to take the joint completely apart, pull the pin, separate the bars, and examine the hidden surfaces of the steel. And nobody took working suspension bridges apart to look inside them. Nobody even knew they needed to. So the bridge was not, by the standards of the time, neglected. There was no obvious rot anyone had ignored, no missing piece a careless inspector had walked past. The thing that killed it was designed to be unseeable. The fatal flaw lived in the one place no one was looking, in the one part of the bridge that had no backup, made worse by a design that traded redundancy for economy back in 1926. That combination is what makes the Silver Bridge such a hard, important lesson. It was not one mistake. It was a chain of them fitting together as neatly and as fatally as the links themselves. A design with no margin for the failure of a single part, a material that failed without warning, a flaw in a hidden location, an inspection regime that had no way to find such a thing and no requirement to try, and a bridge built for the cars of the 1920s, carrying the heavy traffic of the 1960s. Pull out any one of those, and maybe those 46 people drive home for Christmas. All of them were true at once. And here is the part that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The Silver Bridge was not the only one of its kind. 100 miles up the Ohio River, at St. Mary's, West Virginia, stood its twin. That bridge, crossing from St. Mary's over to Newport, Ohio, had been built by the very same American Bridge Company, from the very same set of blueprints, with the very same 2 eyebar chain design. It had opened to traffic just months after the Silver Bridge, in October of 1928. For 39 years, it had carried its own daily stream of cars, with its own hidden joints and its own aging high-strength steel, and no one had thought twice about it. When the engineers understood what had brought down the Silver Bridge, the realization about its sister was immediate and chilling. If a buried crack in a single eyebar could drop one of these bridges in a second, with no warning, then the other one was a loaded gun. The St. Mary's Bridge was closed to traffic right away. The state was not going to gamble a second town on the hope that lightning would not strike twice. The bridge sat shut, and then it was torn down. There was simply no safe way to keep it standing, no inspection that could promise it would not do exactly what its twin had done. An entire bridge was condemned, not for anything anyone could see, but for what the Silver Bridge had taught them might be hiding where they could not. For the record, a third bridge of similar design was built in Brazil, the Hercílio Luz Bridge at Florianópolis. It used the same kind of high-strength steel, but it had been built with 4 eyebars per link instead of 2, and with a higher safety factor. It had the redundancy the Silver Bridge lacked. and it survived for decades longer, which only underlines the point. The fatal choice was never the steel alone. It was building with no second chance. The collapse reached all the way to the White House. Within weeks, President Lyndon Johnson convened a task force on bridge safety. The administrator of the Federal Highway Administration, Lowell Bridwell, led it. In February of 1968, just 2 months after the bridge went down, the government announced a sweeping program to examine the safety of hundreds of thousands of bridges across the country, working with the states, with railroad bridges as well as highway bridges pulled into the count. For the first time, the nation was going to take a hard, organized look at what it had been driving over without really checking. That work took a few years to become law. On the 27th of April 1971, the National Bridge Inspection Standards took effect. And this is the legacy of those 46 people in the cold river. This is what their deaths bought. Before the Silver Bridge, there was no national rule for how, or how often, or by whom, the bridges of the United States had to be inspected. A bridge might be looked at regularly, or it might not be. There was no shared standard, no required training, no national record. After the Silver Bridge, all of that changed. The National Bridge Inspection Standards required that bridges be inspected on a regular schedule, generally at least once every 2 years, by people who were actually trained to do it. It required written reports. It required that the findings be recorded and that needed repairs be flagged and tracked. It built, for the first time, a national accounting of the condition of American bridges, from the pilings in the riverbed to the deck under your tires. The standards changed the very idea of how you inspect. The Silver Bridge proved that you could not always trust your eyes, that the thing that kills you might be sealed inside a joint where no human gaze can reach. So inspection grew beyond looking. It came to include the kinds of testing that can find a flaw hidden inside solid metal without taking it apart, the careful watching of critical, non-redundant parts, the understanding that some designs have no margin and must be treated with special suspicion. The whole profession learned to ask a new question about every structure. If one piece of this fails, does the whole thing come down, or is there a second path? On a bridge with no redundancy, every critical part has to be watched, as though lives depend on it alone. Because, as Point Pleasant learned, they do. Those standards have governed American bridges ever since. They have been revised only a handful of times in more than 50 years, which tells you how much the people who wrote them, in the shadow of that river, got right. Every time a worker in a hard hat climbs under an overpass with a clipboard and a flashlight and a set of tools, every time a bridge near you gets that quiet, regular checkup that you never see and never think about, you are looking at the direct descendant of what happened at Point Pleasant on the 15th of December, 1967. There is one more thread to this story, and it is the strange one. In the months before the bridge fell, the people of Point Pleasant had reported a series of unsettling things. Strange lights in the sky, a tall winged figure with glowing red eyes that some claimed to have seen out near an old wartime munitions site. Years later, the writer John Keel gathered these accounts into a book and tied them to the disaster and gave the creature the name that has clung to the town ever since: the Mothman. There are people to this day who believe the sightings were an omen of the collapse. It makes for a haunting tale, and Point Pleasant has, in its way, made a kind of peace with it, even built a small statue. But it is worth saying plainly, the Silver Bridge did not fall because of a monster or a warning from beyond. It fell because of a crack 1/10 of an inch deep, in a single steel bar with no backup, growing in the dark for 40 years where no one could see it, on a bridge built for a lighter age and asked to carry a heavier one. The real story is stranger than the legend because the real story is true, and because the real story can happen again anywhere we stop paying attention. So think about the last bridge you drove across. Maybe it was this morning. Maybe you will cross one on the way home tonight. You almost certainly did not look at it. You trusted it, the way the people in those cars trusted the Silver Bridge, because it had always been there, and it had always held. That trust is not foolish. It is the quiet foundation of ordinary life. But it is not free, and it is not automatic. It rests on a system of inspection and standards, and trained people doing unglamorous work, a system that did not exist until 46 people went into the Ohio River 2 weeks before Christmas and forced a nation to build it. The next time you cross a bridge, without a second thought, remember that the reason you can is written in the names of the dead at Point Pleasant. They paid for your safe crossing, and the least we owe them is to never stop checking. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the kind that change how you see the ordinary world around you, you know what to do. Subscribe,